Also, another thing that I wanted to talk about before I got sidetracked and went all over the sphere of feminism and views of women and all this stuff about why women don't ask for their needs in relationships and why subsequently this leads to, or subsequently, however you pronounce it, this leads to solitude for both genders. See, the problem is that I think I have said this in another video as well, that at least as far as I've noticed, the problem is that for most of human history, again, the world, society has been male-centric, right? So because men made the power, they had the power and made the rules and all that, they created a society, of course, that suits their needs. And one of the most obvious ways in which this is seen is the fact that women are expected to quit their jobs once they get pregnant, in many places. Or if they don't quit their jobs, they go through something called the pregnancy penalty, or the motherhood penalty, whatever it's called, meaning they take a huge hit financially because of the years or that they have to, also because of maybe the few years they have to spend in maternity leave, but also because they're still the ones who are being tasked with taking care of probably 80% of a child's needs. So when a woman goes back to work after having a child, she's still the one who has to take care of, has to sacrifice most of her time to take care of the child because the father can't be bothered a lot of the times, if the father is even in the picture. This is another reason why natality is going down and why people are single, because women no longer want to invest in relationships. Because most women don't want to sacrifice their entire lives to have children. All right. This is more specifically about the topic of children. But it's also, very tangent on the attitudes towards women in general, because they go hand in hand. A lot of men are still in that very old-fashioned mentality of, well, women are the ones who have to do all the sacrifices. They're the ones who have to stay at home. I'm not going to help with the child rearing. I'm not going to take the kid to kindergarten. I'm not going to go to parent-teacher conferences and, tutor the child or whatever the hell else they should help with. So to a large extent, women are basically faced with choosing between having themselves and having a life that they like on a personal level and on an individual level, or on the other hand, being in a relationship with children or without children, and having to sacrifice too much of themselves, all right, in order to keep the relationship going. And you might say, again, that I'm overgeneralizing and that a lot of men are not that narrow-minded. Well, again, bear in mind that I spent most of my life in Eastern Europe, and also I have relatives. I actually come from a mixed cultural background, so I come from partially Western European roots as well. I've traveled to Western Europe extensively. I know what the mentalities are, no matter how far west you go, no matter how Westerosi you get. Most of them are still very traditional minded in the idea that they're not going to pitch in with the child rearing, and not equally, nowhere near equally. Maybe financially if you're lucky, right, as a woman. And also that they generally expect women in relationships to adapt to their needs and their lives, as opposed to meeting women halfway and learning what women need in relationships, right? So a lot of women feel like there's too much of a sacrifice, I feel like, again, it's going back to the idea of men have been used to this, they have been used to this normalized slavery of women since the dawn of time. And they just can't adapt, or they don't want to, better said, to the fact that, women have different needs and that women deserve to have a full life as well. Women should not have to choose between, their needs in relationships on a biological plane and their needs when it comes to child rearing, again, on a biological plane, and choosing, their spiritual needs, their individual needs, because men have never had to make that choice, right? For most of human history. I mean, you might argue that, oh, well, men also had to sacrifice in the past because they had to work hard and whatever, and they had to take care of their families. Sure, I'm not trying to say that men always had it easy and whatever, but no matter how hard men had it, women had it worse, all right? It's like women were dying in childbirth because there was no contraception, or even when there was contraception, it was banned, because religious idiots or, I don't know, like totalitarian states that needed women. I mean, the communists banned contraception, for instance, and it wasn't out of religious reasons. It was because they needed, cannon fodder. They needed drones to keep pushing the wheels while they sat on top of the throne and, lived lavishly while the average population was starving to death. But again, let me not digress into that topic. So where was I? I interrupted a little bit. So going back, yeah. The reason why, again, a lot of women feel like they can't ask for their needs in relationships is because they think they have to trade in their human rights in order to get these needs met in relationships, which is basically an impossible situation. Because women, just like men, they have a biological side and they have a spiritual side, right? So whereas society very much acknowledges men's, both their biological and their spiritual side, right? You've never heard a man being asked, it's like, it's like you never heard a man have a dilemma of, I want to have 3 kids and I also want to be a doctor. I'm going to have to choose which one of these I'm going to go for in life, never, right? Because men have had a designated personal assistant called the wife who had to take care of the babies and the dirty business while he was free to pursue his interests, right? So men got both their biological needs met in relationships, through reproduction, and also they got their spiritual needs met because they were allowed to get an education and to pursue their interests, right, and work and be independent and all that. But women were not given the same rights, and still to a large extent, it's disgusting to me actually when you hear, men saying this phrase of like, oh, well, women want to have their cake and eat it too. Which, I don't know if I'm autistic or anything, but I never fully understood this saying. I always thought it was a dumb saying, no offense, because, like, what do you mean you want to have your cake and eat it too? Like, isn't that why you get cake, to eat it? I don't really understand the saying, to be honest. But anyway, again, maybe I'm weird. I digress. The bottom line is I think it's disgusting. I know what the meaning is. I know the meaning because I've researched it now. And I think it's disgusting. Basically it's like saying that women are somehow asking for something supernatural to have both their biological needs met and acknowledged, at the very least acknowledged, because that's the first step to them being met, and then also getting their spiritual needs met. It's kind of like men expect women to just be animals, to be happy with just reproduction and, and that's it. Like, you shouldn't have dreams, you shouldn't have a personality, you shouldn't have hobbies, you shouldn't have interests. And I'm not just talking about, having careers here, because I know I've actually heard a lot of men say things like, even, men that I've met personally, who say things like, why did women need rights? It's not like they're curing cancer or anything. And funny enough, actually, I do know, not directly, but indirectly, I actually know of women who work in cancer research. And I'm sure that there are women working in all kinds of research and, doing all kinds of things that are very useful to society at large. But the bottom line is not, are they curing cancer? Because then I could just as easily ask the same question about men. How many men out there are curing cancer versus how many men are out there making a living, cheating and stealing and selling kids into prostitution or something. So if you really want to play the who has the moral high ground game, like, it's like, I think women would win hands down. It's not even a contest, it's like, definitely no contest. Women would definitely win the moral high ground. Because, it's like women, yeah, they may not, there may not be as many women throughout history who have been geniuses. But again, if you actually look at the short period of time that women have had any rights at all versus how much of history they were deprived of rights, I think women have proven themselves to be very capable overall, There are already quite a few women who have achieved pretty extraordinary things. And, you know, when you compare like how many men, how many years men have had since the dawn of time where they were, you know, allowed to pursue their own interest and, you know, to have a life and to contribute to the world in a spiritual sense, not just through reproduction, you know, because like any animal can reproduce. I've actually said this in another video, I think in the one where I talked about the differences between men and women. And I said, it's ridiculous. And this is why, this is another great point that I disagree with, that I disagree on. I don't know how to express it exactly grammatically correct. That I disagree on when I compare myself to Jordan Peterson. I mean, that I don't agree with Jordan Peterson saying, okay, that's a better way of putting it. He said that women are fulfilled through motherhood. I think I've also said this in this other video. And I thought it was such a heresy to say that. And in fact, I have personally known a lot of women, and you also hear about them. I mean, you hear them in anonymous forum posts where they talk about how sad their lives are because they haven't reached their dreams, or because they had kids too young, or because they listened to their family and they chose to marry at the age of 20 and become a housewife as opposed to pursuing an education, and how they ended up regretting that. And I've known cases, again, personally in my own family as well, of women who had kids, right? And they were decent mothers, and they still ended up to the end of their lives and felt like they wasted their lives because they were never allowed to pursue, you know, the careers they wanted, the dreams they had. You know, never traveled. They weren't given the opportunities to travel, to see anything of the world. And they died with massive frustrations. And I've actually been thinking about this on a more philosophical tone, that I think the reason why women these days are so focused, have so little interest, honestly, in things like, I mean, child care and all this stuff. And they're so focused on education and trying different things and learning different things and traveling and all this stuff, is kind of because we are carrying all the unfulfilled wishes of all the previous generations of women. And I know this sounds kind of sci-fi, but, you know, I know that there's a branch of Jewish mysticism that actually encourages what I'm saying. In the idea that, you know, you pass on the karmas of one generation to another. So like, let's say if you come from a bloodline that, you know, let's say your forefathers wanted to be doctors for like 3 generations, but they failed, you're going to be born with like the accumulated, frustrated ambitions of the previous generations and also your own desires, right? So it puts that much more pressure on you to fulfill everything in one lifetime. And this is, you know, as far as I've heard, you know, is not gender specific, but I would argue that there are things that are definitely gender specific, just as there are parts of our DNA that have to do specifically with the mother side of the family or the father side of the family. I think it makes sense to think that, you know, there are women specific or genes and in memories and stuff, epigenetics and all this stuff that is passed down from your mother's lineage, you know, from one woman to another. And if you think about it, like all of the frustrated dreams and ambitions of like generations of women, I know that my mother, for instance, I mean, she also had the misfortune of spending, you know, the first 37 years of her life under communism when she didn't even have the right to leave the country. I mean, unless you were part of the secret security and kissed the right asses, which is something she would have never deigned to do, you couldn't leave the country, really. Not really. So, and she always told me, oh my God, like I always dreamt of traveling. And my sister and I, you know, we both travel. Like my sister has traveled way more than I have. Like she has been all over the world. Like, I don't know, like maybe not literally all over the world, but she's traveled extensively. I've only traveled around Europe so far, but I hope to change that soon. But I definitely, when compared to my mother, we're much more well-traveled and more interested in travel, you know, and I think that's because these previous generations of women just never had the chance to do these things, right? So, like, I don't think men understand that, you know, the reason they don't understand that is because they've taken these things for granted, you know, for a lot of history, they've taken stuff for granted, like the fact that, oh, they can pursue a career, that's not a big deal to a man. You know, to a woman, it's still, even in today's world, right? There are many women who maybe are the first woman in their family and their bloodline to graduate from university, maybe. And it's a big deal. It's like a huge achievement, right? Not just for yourself, but in the name of all those women who didn't have the opportunity to do these things, you know? And I mean, this is more on a philosophical note, why I also think, let's say, not to do with biology, but why I also think that women are just prioritizing other things. And then there are also things like the fact that, you know, there are socio-economic factors. And maybe I will talk about that in another video, because this is definitely going on for too long. But another thing that I wanted to say is that I've said this again in another video, and I want to put it again like this, that to me, as far as I've noticed, is that, you know, men are basically blackmailing women to give up their rights, human rights, in order to get their biological needs met, which is just unacceptable, you know? And a lot of women are just not putting up with it. And that's why there is such a decrease in, you know, marriage, or an increase of divorces, and, you know, a lack of interest. Like women, and look, again, I also get into socio-economic reasons. Like I said, like a lot of this is just marriage is not reliable. You know, women just don't get as much security as they used to get out of marriage, out of family. And, you know, I think it's ridiculous to just ignore these very simple facts and the simple realities of life, you know, that, for instance, for a woman, it's a huge risk and a huge investment to have a family, to have children. And nowadays, they're basically expected to do all of this either at the complete expense of their own interest, right? Like they're expected to just basically commit suicide upon entering marriage and decide, you know, from now on, I'm just gonna please my husband and my children, and that's it. I'm basically gonna, you know, I'm basically gonna go on autopilot and live like, I don't know, an amoeba. And like not pursue any of my interests or passions. Or they're like expected to, again, do everything, which is ridiculous, you know, like work full time and not get any help from the partner. You know, it's like, I know, you know, the few women that I know who have both a career and they have a child, they're constantly exhausted, you know, because like, of course, as any human being would. And it's not because of feminism. It's not because it can be done to raise a child. I actually think about this, you know, the way that I was raised when I was a kid. And I can say, actually, my father, despite all of his very, very many faults and potentially being a sociopath, in my theory, at the very least, because he had a good father, he had a good, I mean, partially good role model, helped with the housework, you know, which is, when I was growing up, I thought that was normal. I thought every man helped with the housework. I didn't even realize until I became an adult how rare it was. Like, oh my God, like if you had a partner, especially in Eastern Europe, having a partner as a woman who wanted to, you know, vacuum and like did the cooking on Saturday, that was like effing unheard of, you know, almost unheard of. And so many women, you know, in these generations, they sometimes grew up, you know, having to work full time and doing all the cooking and doing all the cleaning and helping the child with the, you know, homework and everything. So they were like, you know, squeezed lemons without any energy. So again, this is why women these days are no longer investing. Again, because as I mentioned, another thing, okay, I want to touch on one last subject so that I don't record a totally separate video about this. Having to do with the topic of security. Women need security, all right? And like I said, this is non-negotiable. This is just like a fish needs water, or like people in general need, you know, people need food, shelter, safety, and all this stuff. Women need security in relationships, all right? Women have evolved to need security in relationships. And this is because women get pregnant and because women are physically weaker than a man. And this is also, again, I'm going to be also mentioning another of Teal Swan's videos, because she's had a bunch of them where she basically tries to justify polygamy and polyamory. which to me sound like complete nonsense. And again, I've said this, I can explain why women care about fidelity and justifiably care about fidelity just as much as a man does. The reason why it seems as more acceptable for a man to care about fidelity and for a woman to not be particular about it is because of institutionalized sexism. All right. That's just it. It's because men could abuse women and get away with it and nobody cared. Women were not in a position to complain about it. But that doesn't mean that it makes women happy to live in polyamorous relationships. And one thing, speaking of this topic of security and polyamory, I would argue that this idea, I mean, she had a video, Teal Swan had a video where she was talking about something actually about safety, either about safety or security and polyamory. And she said that something along the lines of like, just imagine if you could just get security without factoring in sex as, I don't know, a factor in general. What role would sexuality play in your life or something like that? And I was thinking, like, what? That doesn't make any sense. And again, I would say, again, from a biological point of view, women need the security of a monogamous relationship. You can't tell me shit. If you bring up this topic of polyamory, it doesn't make any sense because you also have to understand it's not supernatural. So like if a man is expected to give his resources, his time, his energy to invest in a relationship, in a monogamous relationship, and the children that will result from this relationship, he is not going to do all of that for a child that is not his own, all right? And this is a very controversial topic. I realize this. And I know nowadays, I'm not trying to say that, oh my God, if you have a child that you can't find a man. But I'm looking at it from a very cold-bloodedly rational perspective, all right? And the truth is that we are much more instinctive than people want to admit. All right. And for good reason, because our instincts have evolved over, millions of years of evolution to keep us alive. So they're not there for, by accident. And what I'm trying to get at is that, if she is advocating for this polyamorous society where people just have multiple partners, it doesn't make any sense to me. Because again, if the reason men used to give their time and resources to women was because the women would carry their children. And it was a fair trade-off, to be honest, to some extent, right? The error is thinking that, again, women should sacrifice everything in order to get their needs met. Let's not forget, again, and I mentioned this, that in today's world, women can pay their own money, can pay their own things. They can have their own money, right? So things are being equaled out more. So it's possible for men and women to pitch in almost equally when it comes to child rearing, for instance, and child raising, right? And I say almost because, yes, again, it's still the woman who gets pregnant and she goes through all that mess, especially the first year or two after childbirth. She has to deal with all these changes and the risks of pregnancy and all that stuff. So yes, the toll is still much greater on the woman. This is why men kind of have to compensate it by, being available, being willing to help out, to be there for them, etc., right? But women will always need security from a man, right? She mentioned it as if to say that, oh, if women would feel totally secure and safe, let's say in an environment, that they would just, sleep with a lot of men and they would be happy with sleeping with a lot of men without getting security from one guy. I don't agree with this shit whatsoever. Because again, it doesn't make any sense biologically. Women are wired to be selective for good reason, again, because nature only wants the best to reproduce. And also because women get pregnant and they're physically weaker, even if a woman, let's say, even if we lived in a hypothetically very safe environment, right? Let's say we lived in some kind of utopian, intergalactic society, like, this is the age of Aquarius, that song. And we lived in some kind of society where, let's say, for 200 years, there would have been no crimes against women. Like all women were in total safety and they were allowed to be themselves and didn't have to fear men in general or discrimination. Their rights would be protected and all this. I would argue that even in that society, women would still need security from a man because, again, women carry the baby. That's it. That is the main logic, because for a woman, being pregnant is a state of massive vulnerability, and a woman would need a partner to be there for her throughout the pregnancy and after the pregnancy, financially, physically, emotionally, on every plane. All right? And also because women are physically weaker than men, they will still have that instinct of, caring about whether this guy is trustworthy or not. So I don't think that, if we lived in some kind of a utopian universe, that women would just be happy to sleep with random men. I don't buy that. And in fact, this actually leads me to another thing that I wanted to say, another observation I've had over the years, that have you noticed, by the way, that the women, and this is actually one of the topics I wanted to discuss here in this video, the topic of women who say they don't need security. This is a big one. And have you noticed, by the way, speaking of Teal Swan, that some of the women who are the most open to polyamory, right? Or I won't say polygamy, because there's a difference. Like, polygamy is kind of when you say polygamy, it's more like from the man's side. It's like institutionalized, religiously based, basically chauvinistic mentality of like men can just leave 50 women pregnant and not pull their weight of being a partner and a husband, basically, because that's what it boils down to. But polyamory, which is a more modern term, makes it actually more open to women. And there are women out there who are like trying polyamory, honestly. And this is what I wanted to say. Don't you think it's funny that some of the women who are open to polyamory, aside from the ones who are clearly mentally unstable, and you will see some of those, but most of them are women who have a lot of wealth, or they have a lot of connections, or they have a lot of power. If you think about it, think of women like, Jada Pinkett Smith, or a while ago, I read this article about Tilda Swinton, the British actress, that she's in some kind of a weird, I don't know if she still is, but at the time, she was in some kind of a weird menage a trois sort of arrangement with her husband of over 2 decades, I think, with whom she has 2 or 3 kids, and her boyfriend. And she has a live-in boyfriend who lives with her husband and her husband is cool with this. And, speaking of unusual relationships, polyamory, whatever the hell you want to call it. And don't you think it's funny? And I think the reason I say this is because polyamory for a woman makes sense. And by the way, all of these women, Teal Swan, Tilda Swinton, Jada Pinkett, these are the examples that I can think of off the top of my head. But I have seen, minor versions of these very famous women in everyday existence, right? Number one that I want you to focus on, all of these women have children, right? They're all wealthy. They're all famous. They have a large support network, right? Because these things mean that she has a lot of security already, right? So when a woman has a lot of security already, she's not going to care that much if a man gives her security, right? So it doesn't mean that she doesn't care about security. It means that she's getting it from someplace other than her romantic partner. For the average woman, though, like Karen, who's the cashier at a supermarket, right, who doesn't have millions of dollars, doesn't have a famous last name, doesn't have a rich daddy, doesn't have, let's say, a strong support network of followers and cult worshippers or whatever, it's a totally different issue, right? She's probably going to care a great deal if her potential partner can give her security, not just for her, but her potential future children. And the reason I pointed out that they all had children makes sense biologically. Again, and you see this a lot. Once women have reproduced and the child starts to reach a certain age, right? Teenager, let's say mid-teens or something, right? When they start to become independent, they will no longer care that much about, let's say, getting a provider husband, right? Or a good father figure or whatever, because their kids are already grown, right? So it makes sense that by the time the kids are grown, biologically, they can start to loosen up a little bit, to relax and think, okay, I'm not supposed to, marry a guy who is going to be a good father figure, a provider and whatever. I can just be free to fool around, It makes sense, again, because the children are already grown. She has successfully reproduced. Again, from a biological perspective, very cold-blooded. And on the other end of the spectrum of women who say they don't need security, and these are the sad ones, are women who make themselves constantly sexually available to a lot of men. And these are the complete opposite of women, oftentimes the complete opposite of women who have a lot of security. And either these women, I mean, most of the times, these are women who are financially desperate, most of the times. But not only, I've seen women who do this kind of thing and maybe they're doing okay financially, but they don't have emotional security. They don't have a safety network. They don't have a support system. They don't have, they don't have, let's say, strong interpersonal relations, people to meet their needs emotionally, someone to talk to, someone to whose shoulder to cry on in case of hardship. They don't have people to rely on in case of an emergency. And these people, these women, because they're so desperate, they will not risk upsetting men by imposing anything on them. And really, these women are not just doing a disservice to themselves, because by, basically sleeping around with almost any man, they are not going to secure a guy's resources or get security from them. Oftentimes they're taken for granted, but they're also doing a huge disservice to other women because, again, as I mentioned at some point in this video, this very long ass video, because I'm looking at the timestamps now, as I mentioned at some point in this video, right? As long as men think, well, as long as these women exist and men get the message that they can easily get laid, they're not going to try very hard to understand women or to be good partners or husbands. That's pretty much what it boils down to. And another sad fact is, that goes hand in hand with these two opposing forces of women who claim they don't need security. In other words, are lying to themselves or just, for some reason are out of the loop, like in the first category, like I mentioned, these women who have successfully reproduced and they have a lot of money, they don't care. All right, so they can afford to experiment, basically, is what I'm saying. Because they have a lot of safety, a lot of status, a lot of let's not forget, of course, if you're famous and you're wealthy, you have much higher levels of security on every plane, right? It's much, again, if you end up in the hospital and your name is Tilda Swinton, you definitely are going to be looked at first. They're not going to look at Karen from the supermarket who has basic medical coverage, right? Like I said, so they have massive levels of security, right? Of course, also bodyguards, right? Bulletproof cars, you name it. And so you have these women who have basically maybe don't care anymore because, again, their instincts are basically not so active anymore because they have successfully reproduced. So they don't care as much, but they will still care, of course, because they're still women and they're physically weaker. So they still have to worry about potential aggressors or something like that, but they won't care as much as a younger woman who wants to reproduce at some point, if a man gives them security in a relationship or not. On the other hand, and these other women that I mentioned who just have very low self-esteem and, are just some desperate one way or another. And I actually had this conversation with a guy at some point, and I was actually just telling him point blank a lot of the things that I said in this video, that I think women generally just don't care about sex, but they put up with it in order to get security. And most of the time, all right? And this guy was like, that's not true, because I had this girlfriend who wanted to sleep with me all the time. And I was like, what do you mean all the time? And he was like, yeah, even when it was that time of the month. And I was like, first of all, ew. Second of all, to me, that's always a telltale sign that a woman has very desperate situations and or little to no self-esteem, because no woman, honestly, who respects herself and her body would, be sexually active during that time of the month. It doesn't make any sense. And again, if a woman is truly honest with herself and listens to her body and her instincts, she would not put up with it, right? If a woman is that desperate that she's willing to sleep with a guy every single day, it means that she is desperate for male attention for one reason or another. And in this case, I actually asked him, let me guess, Does this woman come from a good financial background? Does she have a lot of wealth? And he said, no, quite the opposite. She was actually in financial dire straits. And I was like, well, I hate to break it to you, but I don't think this woman was just, in love with your, I don't know, body and mastery in the bedroom. I think the woman was just desperate to have a place to live because they were living together. So yeah, I pretty much, that rested my case. I swear, I've never seen my theories contradicted. Again, I'm going to blow my own horn a little bit. But this is what I wanted to say. And yet another subject that is very tangent on these two extremes of women who, say they don't care about security, is the topic of women being brainwashed. Oh my God. Women are brainwashed all the time that being promiscuous is cool, that you have to make yourself sexually available. If I had money, like a little bit of money for every time I heard a friend, throughout my life, or an acquaintance say something like, the first time I slept with my boyfriend, or the first time I had sex ever, it was because I was the last virgin in my classroom in high school. Or it was because I was afraid that if I didn't do it, he would leave and do it with someone else. Or it was because, I don't know, I felt unattractive and I thought that if I lost my virginity, it meant that I was attractive. Do you know how often you hear this shit? It's unfucking-believable. And I should have apologized in advance for all the cussing happening in this video. I apologize now. But it's so gross. But this is the consequence of women systematically being brainwashed by the media. And of course, men are totally on board with this, because who gains out of it, actually? It's men, right? If men manage to fool women into thinking that, oh, it's cool to be promiscuous, that you shouldn't ask for security before sleeping with someone because that's not cool, and you're not a cool chick if you ask for security, right? Then who gains out of that? It's men, of course. They get laid for free without meeting women's needs in relationships. And who ends up, suffering out of that? It's women, of course. Like, why can't women see this? I don't really understand. I think what is happening is that women are, first of all, in general, again, going back to biology, women, I think, are wired genetically to care a lot more about social support and social validation. I think so. I mean, I'm not putting myself in that category. I'm a complete freak, actually, because, well, not really. I mean, I feel pressures, not anymore, actually, because I basically have taken social pressures out of my DNA and removed them one by one with a tweezer in the past 34 years of my existence. But when I was, let's say, a teenager, oh my God, I definitely felt, more of a pressure, and I was so afraid of being shamed and criticized and all this stuff. And now I'm like, F you, F this, F everyone, F society, F the world. Like, I just do whatever. But women in general, I have to admit, are not like that. Most girls, especially in high school, oh my God, they would never go against, expectations, anything to fit in. And to some extent, look, it's true for men as well. But the difference is that for men, social pressures are not pushing them against their biology and against what feels right for them. It doesn't tell them, to drive the car with the brakes on, which is what's happening to women. Like, women are being brainwashed from increasingly younger ages, even in my generations. And I graduated high school in 2007. And they are brainwashed to think that, oh, it's cool to start your sex life when you're 13, 14, or whatever. That guys like women who are sexual. And of course they do, because, when they're 13, 14, I mean, they have the brain the size of a gerbil. Like, forget it. What gerbil? The size of an M&M. And it's like, what else can they think about, Women are the ones who should put their foot down and decide what their interests are. Because again, and I said this, the only way that women are going to get their needs met is by staying together, staying united. To a large extent, as long as men are allowed by and large to just sleep around without any consequences from women or society or other men or anything, they're just gonna, do the same mess over and over again. And you see these arguments from men that, oh, it's women's fault because they go for men who are very attractive and those men don't want them and all this nonsense. First of all, men go for women they find attractive as well, right? So it's like, I've known guys who are, not particularly wealthy, not particularly good looking, but they all want to marry Claudia Schiffer in her 20s. And they're not going to lower their standards, right? And first of all, the problem is that all men today don't respect women's needs, because what happened again in the past, very few men were allowed to get away with promiscuity. In fact, I would say if you go far back enough in time, no men were allowed to get away with this, right? If you look, all you have to do is look at the literature and the art of past days. I actually remember seeing this in, I think it's called, what the heck is it called? By Jane Austen. There's this, not Pride and Prejudice, the other one. Oh God, I forgot what it was called. Persuasion. Yeah, that's the right. There was this part in Persuasion. I remember reading that novel years ago, and that really stuck to me. And very briefly, the story of the novel is basically, this young woman who was persuaded, of course, the title is very suggestive as usual with Jane Austen, persuaded by her family to renounce a love interest that she had when she was around 18 because the guy in question did not have money. So he was this young, poor guy, I think an orphan or something, didn't come from a good family, unlike her. So even though they were both in love and whatever, and she really liked him, she ended up refusing his advances or something, or breaking up with him because of her family's interference. And now she has to see him again 10 years later when he has made a name for himself. He ended up joining the Marines or something. The Marines, oh my God, they didn't exist back then. Not the Marines. What the hell is it called? Was it called the Marine? No, it wasn't called that. The Navy. Yeah, that's right. So he joined the military navy of Britain or something. So he became like a young officer, which of course was a respectable thing, decent income, whatever. And so she is forced to meet him again, and he shows up in her entourage of family and friends, and she is watching him from afar, courting two other women, basically. I mean, she's actually watching him from afar, analyzing his behavior. And at some point in the book, what really got to me was that she said the only thing, that she was kind of, analyzing his character, typical Jane Austen fashion, from the eyes of this main character of this girl who was seeing him again after 10 years. And, she was kind of admiring him for the most part, saying that he grew up into a fine young man, good character, decent, handsome, whatever. And then at some point she says, the only thing anyone could reproach him for is the fact that he is showing attention to two young ladies at the same time. And I remember thinking, holy shit, how societies have decayed and how civilization has gone down. In fact, forget about Jane Austen. Actually, if you read a lot of literature, not a lot of literature because I haven't read a lot of it, but if you pick up books that were written in the 1700s, 1800s, in Western Europe, in Italy, in Britain, and whatever, I think that was the peak of civilization. I mean, nowadays I think people are just going backwards. We're heading towards the primordial soup now compared to the level of culture and education and civilization that people had back then. I don't know. To some extent, I'm not trying to say that everything was better back then. Of course not. They had some stupid habits as well. But, I think the morality of society was much higher, there was much higher demands on the average person to have healthy values and respect and all this stuff. So respect for other people as well, especially the higher up you went in social status. In any case, this was one example that I noticed where, again, this illustrates what I wanted to say, is that societies basically confronted men who didn't respect women's needs. This goes back to what I said initially, that young men were not allowed by society, by other men even, and by women in general, to waste a young woman's time endlessly and not marry her, right? Basically, it was seen as very disgusting. And for most of human history, the men who did this were basically had to resort to seeing working girls for the rest of their lives. And in fact, another great example of the same kind of mentality is in Gone with the Wind. You know, if you remember in the movie Gone with the Wind, when Scarlett O'Hara sees Rhett Butler for the first time, she's walking down the stairs and her friend is by her side, and she leans to her friend and says, "Who is this man, the dark, nasty one who looks at me like he knows what I look like naked," basically, something along those lines. And her friend leans over to her and says, "Oh, my dear, don't you know who that is? He has the most frightful reputation because he took a girl out for a walk and refused to marry her." End of sentence. Think about that for a second. There were very serious consequences for men who didn't respect women's needs, especially, of course, the higher up you went in social standards, in social status, because to be fair, sadly, of course, it was because these women in higher social families were protected by their families. You know, their families would be very careful. They would watch over them like a hawk to make sure that the young woman is not wasting her time on a bad, unsuitable partner, you know. And let's not also forget that Rhett Butler, the character in Gone with the Wind, basically spent his time in brothels, you know. And there was another part, you know, where he was mentioned to be shunned by all the good society of his community. In fact, to a large extent, one of the reasons why he was shunned by good society was precisely because of this disrespect that he showed towards a young lady. And this was something that happened in the past all the times. In fact, I would say in Eastern Europe, when my parents were growing up, even in the 50s, maybe 50s, 60s, still, these kinds of mentalities were still pretty much in place, you know, maybe not to this extent, but it was just a thing, you know, and also because people knew one another, that also leads me a little bit into the socio-economic reasons of why people are single and women's needs and all this stuff is because, you know, people lived in smaller communities where everyone knew everyone, right? So the chances of a woman wasting her time on a man who was not worthy of her time, were very slim. Because by the time you were like 18 or something, by the time you graduated high school, you knew everyone, right? Everyone knew everyone else's business. So you knew this guy was the butcher's boy. This one was the preacher's boy. This guy, you know, was going to college to study mathematics. This guy was part of the police. He came from this family. He came from this other family. You knew their grandparents, their parents. You know, you knew their entire fucking bloodline. You knew what diseases they had in their families and all this stuff. Contrast this to what is happening in today's world where women can, you know, resort to finding spouses online, where a guy can lie about literally anything. And again, I actually know this from other women who have gone on dates where they found out the guys they were dating lied about literally everything, including their names. You know, they lied about going to college. They never went to college. They lied about where they were working. They lied about where they were living. Literally made up an entire story of who they were. And there's no way for women to check these things nowadays. So they waste precious time on this bullshit that should never happen, really. And, I mean, obviously the most obvious examples of this are cases like the Tinder swindler. Although in that case, I also think the women were naive, but whatever. Let me not get into that. But yes, this is another thing. And yeah, so I think the main last idea that I wanted to send is this idea that women are brainwashed. Women are brainwashed by the media, by men, that it's cool to be promiscuous, that you shouldn't expect security, that, you know, you should walk all over your whatever feels right and comfortable for you to get social validation, to get a pat on the back. Good for you for being a nice woman who provides free sexual services to men, without expecting anything in return, even though you're putting yourself at massive risk, you know. Think about all the nonsense that women put themselves through, like even just taking contraceptives, all contraceptives that are hormone-based, they wreak havoc on a woman's health. I know so many cases, again, I'm never going to end this video. Like, I know so many cases, since I'm on this topic, I've never taken hormone-based contraceptives because I don't trust them. And I listen to my body. Like, I listen to what feels right to me. And I don't take them because I actually, this is going to sound crazy, but I can tell when a woman is on birth control. Because you can tell from their energy and the way that they talk that they're not fully in touch with their instincts. You know, a woman on contraceptives is kind of like a neutered animal. She's not really sharp and doesn't have the right instincts. And in fact, even though I would subtly pick this up for a long time, it wasn't until recently that I actually read studies that confirmed what I always noticed, that in fact, it changes your brain chemistry to such an extent that you can become a different person. It changes your tastes in men. It changes like everything. And in fact, again, that's what I wanted to say about contraceptives, that I've known so far around 10 women with ages from around 18 to, let's say, 33, who were on birth controls, oral birth controls, and they ended up in a not all of them ended up in a hospital, but they ended up with problems because they developed ovarian cysts. 2 of them ended up in the emergency room of a hospital after some cyst that they didn't even know they had on an ovary burst and caused internal bleeding. And the thing and these are women that I've known personally, by the way. Then I've also known women who were on birth control pills who lost their periods. They were on birth control for like, I don't know how many years. They lost their periods. They went to the gynecologist and the gynecologist said, you know, basically your uterine lining has completely dried up. And if you continue to take these pills, you're probably going to become infertile. Like, I mean, and it basically, it completely changes a woman's instincts. It tricks the brain into thinking that you're pregnant or something like that. And which makes sense that it would completely change your instincts, because if your instincts are not sharp, you know, because your instincts are wired to keep you safe, right? So a normal woman who doesn't take hormones to brainwash her entire system, knows to, you know, be careful around men. First of all, she will be very selective. Second of all, she will know not to put herself in situations where she might get pregnant because her instincts are very sharp. And she will be in touch with that desire of like, oh, I need security and I need this and everything. But if you take birth control, a lot of these instincts become dulled, right? Some of them are even annihilated. And you're basically, like I said, I mean, I actually have seen women on birth control, and some women, the ones that are most obvious are where you see them on birth control versus off birth control. And you can see very definite differences between the way that they behave, the way they, maybe sometimes the way they date. I actually remember reading a story once where a woman was on birth control pills when she started dating her boyfriend. They moved in together, and because she developed some health problems like they often cause, she had to go off of the birth control, and she no longer found her partner attractive, which is like unbelievable, right? And you're expected to put up with this shit because what? Because men can't be bothered to put on a condom, which, by the way, doesn't do anything to them. It doesn't put them at risk medically, you know? And you're expected to meanwhile, women are expected to put all this shit in their body. And then let's not even get into mechanical methods of contraception. Why would you want to put up with all this crap? For what? You know, I don't give a shit what any woman says. I don't care even if, let's say, he's very good in bed. It's not worth it. It is not worth it. Unless this guy, again, gives you security, he's willing to raise your kids, help you raise your kids together, he is not worth it. There's literally nothing that a man can offer a woman that will make up for the lack of security in a relationship. This is why women are staying away from relationships. And men, on the other hand, are being fed this bullshit that, oh, women have sex like men now, and women can enjoy having one night stands, and oh, look, they're having one night stands with rich guys. First of all, I would say it's a very small minority of women who are actually, pardon my French, whoring around and sleeping with a lot of men. And again, these women, I don't know, they probably perfected that method of survival where they depend on guys and, sugar daddies and people. And again, I'm not judging this because you don't know, first of all, you don't know what background the person has. And maybe she just wanted to try it and ended up in that lifestyle. Who the hell knows? But I think it's a very small minority of women who actually do this. Most women, they would have, again, especially if they've never been on birth control, they will have the common sense to stay away from these situations. Because again, they will not feel right. This is the main reason. I mean, to a woman who is in touch with her instincts and respects her body, she will literally feel unnatural around the idea of sleeping with a guy who doesn't give her security. Like I said, it's similar to, if you try to push two magnets of the same polarity together, that is the level of resistance that a sane woman would have around the idea of sleeping with a guy who doesn't give her security. This is why, again, I mentioned this repeatedly. It's not just the reason why women are no longer investing in relationships. It's also why natality is going down. And yeah, because again, if a guy doesn't give a woman security, she is risking a lot more than she's gaining. That's pretty much it. And pretty much, women risk pregnancies, injuries. Again, sex is not even that enjoyable. Like over 70% statistically have never experienced an orgasm. And women don't have as much of a sex drive. That's another thing. I can't believe how many men are so dumb about this. Oh my God. They know nothing about, I can't believe that men are in relationships and they know nothing about the fact that women have a cycle, and basically women only think about sex, 7 days out of 28 tops, and that's if she's healthy. That's if she's healthy and, doesn't have any huge stress or anything. Give or take, all right, a few days, all right? Maybe the women are the most nymphomaniac out there. They will have sex maybe 2 weeks out of 4. And again, that's provided that she's healthy, that the man treats her well, then she feels secure and safe in that relationship and all the stars align and all this stuff. Otherwise, forget about it. So, pretty much. And one last topic, since I'm already way past the marker of anything decency with the length of this video, I want to talk about the topic of who pays on the first date. Because this is something that you hear being debated all the time. I've heard it being debated live all the time. And the way that I would argue, again, what I would argue is that, first of all, as a man, and again, I know this sounds very controversial and very Amish, but I really think that as a man, you shouldn't even be taking out a woman on a date unless you see her as a potential wife. Or, okay, if you don't believe in marriage, let's say potential long-term girlfriend, but you need to keep in mind the fact that women need a sense of security. And to be honest, still the best bet that women have to feel secure is marriage. And honestly, I think that in the old days, it would have been your fathers that taught you this if you're a man. If you are men, right? Your fathers would have told you that, hey, this is how you treat a woman. You don't waste a woman's time. And if you are planning on taking women out for dates, taking a woman out for a date, then it means you have to be ready to take responsibility for this, right? You don't fool around for 2-3 years and then, decide you're bored and you move on to another partner. And another thing, here's the thing, this is why men are so upset about the dating, whatever, and paying at the first date, because the truth is that they look at it very transactionally, I'm expected to pay for the date, but she's not expected to sleep with me. First of all, I remember I actually heard a guy say this on a podcast and it made me laugh. First of all, how much is a dinner? What, $30 or something? 30 euros? I don't know. I guess it depends on where you live and where you take this person. But, so, it's something along those lines, up to 50, let's say 50 euros, $50, whatever. This is for a good restaurant. How much is a dinner or a lunch or something? And how much would be actual, contact with a working girl? I would say it's probably way more expensive. So even if you think of it from purely transactional, points of view, I don't think it's fair to say that, if a woman has her lunch paid, then she should be expected to jump into bed with a guy. That is the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. Number one. And number two, first of all, if a guy, and this is true, even if you're a guy, this is true. If a guy feels like you are not worth paying lunch for, that's already a sign that he's not serious about you. And this is what women instinctively pick up on. And in fact, I would say the reason why women are not attracted to this idea of, going 50-50 on a date, again, there are nuances to this, and a lot of it will depend on context. Like, I would say let's say if both people are in university or students or whatever, I don't think it would be unreasonable for the man to expect to go 50-50, because you probably don't have a lot of money either way. But if a woman, let's say both of them are employed, they're full adults, and or the man is employed and the woman is not employed, I think it's common sense that the guy should pay. And here's the thing, and here's the reason why, and I say this totally as a feminist. And I didn't really fully understand this until I started to look at it biologically, because I've been in a situation sort of like this, where, honest to God, I started to feel attracted to a guy more because he offered to pay for lunch. And this was a guy that he wasn't even like someone I was dating. He was a friend, all right? And I started to all of a sudden kind of think of him as, oh, wait, this guy's kind of cute. Like, suddenly now that he paid my lunch. And I know it was totally out of reflex. It was totally some kind of an instinctive thing. And the way that I would justify it, what women feel about this, is that it makes them, again, feel more secure. Like, if a guy, is willing to pay for the lunch or the dinner or whatever, it gives the woman that sense of security. Like, oh, this guy is willing to impress me or to make me feel comfortable or to take care of my lunch. On the other hand, if a guy goes 50-50, or worse of all, acts like you forgot his wallet, a woman will lose interest in him, because right off the bat, she's getting the message that this guy is not willing to impress me. Number one, he doesn't care about me feeling comfortable. He's not willing to, extend a helping hand or something. You know what I mean? And it's kind of like for a woman, again, because women are constantly instinctively scanning men for, signs for whether he's a good provider for her and her potential future children. If a guy is not even willing to pay for lunch, already the woman gets the message of like, wait a minute, this guy is not dependable. It's like, if he is so sensitive about paying the lunch, then how can I depend on him in case of a crisis, or when I'm 9 months pregnant and I need someone to rub my feet or something, or who's going to take care of me when I'm in a hospital or when I get sick, or like whatever, all this stuff, So even though it's not a conscious process, these are the things, these are the programs that are running in a woman's brain subconsciously. And now the answer to this, honestly, because you hear all of these like debates about like, oh, men don't want to pay 50-50, or like, again, men who say these kinds of things like, oh, well, if a woman expects the man to pay on the first date, then she should provide sexual services, which is disgusting. Honestly, no wonder these guys are single, honestly, because again, it boils down to understanding a woman's biology. And the solution to this, don't get me wrong, there might be women out there who try to play guys, and yes, that's something that men probably should be wary of. But I would argue that even in these situations, as far as I've seen, women, what women do when they play a guy for money, like they take them to restaurants that they choose and then take a lot of their money and whatever, and then don't do anything, they don't offer any sexual services and all this stuff. It's because the women in question pick up on the guy being superficial, and women are way more intelligent than men imagine anyway. So women are very good at reading all kinds of subtle cues and nonverbal things, and even picking up moods and stuff. And honestly, for a woman, it's very obvious if a guy pays for something just because he expects something in return. You know what I mean? So if a woman already, let's say, goes out on a date with a guy, and this guy has this attitude of, I hope to get lucky by the end of the evening, then of course she's probably going to take a superficial approach to it as well. So she's going to be like, oh, this guy clearly only wants, to get laid. So I'm going to see how much he's willing to pay for this, like how desperate is he? Or if he treats me as a superficial thing, then I will treat him as a superficial thing, And the solution to this, as I was trying to say, is that honestly, I think as a guy, like I said, you should not be taking out a woman on a date unless you see her as a serious prospect. It's as simple as that. And really, honestly, if you're honest about this, if a guy is truly interested in a woman, like you see a woman and you say, that's it, that's the woman I want to marry one day, you're not going to feel like, oh my God, I was such an idiot because I paid for lunch. The only men who think like that are men who are never serious about the women that they are with to begin with, right? They're calculating in their minds, how much am I paying for this sexual encounter that I'm expecting, you know? Which is a very superficial attitude to have, and it's a waste of time for the woman. And the way to have it honestly, now, here's the thing. There might be women out there who, for one reason or another, are open to having one night stands or maybe don't want anything serious. As I mentioned, you know, there might be women who are more experimental. They're in a phase where their kids are grown, their instincts are not that sharp, whatever, for whatever reason. They might be interested in just having a fling. The way that you want to make sure that you are not wasting a woman's time as a man is you should be upfront from the beginning. You should have a conversation, ask this woman, hey, what are you looking for right now? Do you want to have a serious relationship? Are you looking for a fling? What is it? Etc., etc., so on and so forth. And if a woman says, you know, I'm totally fine, you know, not looking for something serious, then it's her responsibility. All right. If you take her out for a date and she, I don't know, sulks about you not taking care of the check or the fact that you expect having sex or whatever, then it's on her, right? Because she accepted the terms from the beginning. But that's not what happens a lot of the times. And let's be honest, men know instinctively or not that if they were upfront about it, most women would not want to go out on dates, right? Because like most women, to be honest, it's pretty obvious that they're not interested in shallow relationships, right? So if a man would be honest from the beginning, like, hey, let's, you know, what are you looking for in a relationship right now? And that she would say, I want to get married and have kids. Like, most guys would be like, okay, I should probably stay away from this woman, unless she is that rare specimen that actually impresses him so much that he wants to marry her immediately or something, right? So these are just some thoughts that I've had. Dear God, this video is very long. I may have to, you know, cut it in multiple places. I may have to cut it into parts because, like, this is like... yeah, I've really outdone myself on this one. So these are just some of the thoughts, really some of the thoughts that I have had on the topic of women's needs and why a lot of people are single, why natality is going down, but there are way more things that I could probably mention about this. So yeah, if you're ever interested in me ranting again, please let me know in the comment section about these topics. And of course, I promise that I am not, you know, forgetting about all the other videos that I have promised. But, you know, bear with me here, especially the one on Saturn's nakshatras. That is going to be time consuming. As I mentioned on every one of those videos in the nakshatra series, they do take a lot of time. So yeah, but I will be delivering it totally. All right. Patience, please. So anyway, this has been my long rant. I hope that you, I don't know, find it interesting at least. If, again, if you have listened to all of this, you definitely deserve a medal. Thank you. Kudos to you. And of course, feel free to comment in the comment section. Again, just as long as you keep it civil, any kind of opinion is welcome. And yeah. Hope to see you at my next video. Bye!